The rain had not stopped for 3 days. It came down in sheets against the windows of Rosie's diner, a small brick-and-glass box wedged between a pawnshop and a boarded-up laundromat on the corner of Ninth and Morrow, and the sound it made against the tin awning was a low, relentless drumming that had become as much a part of the place as the smell of bacon grease and burnt coffee. The neon sign above the door had lost its second S years ago, so it read Row Eyes in a sickly pink glow that bled into the wet sidewalk like a wound that would not close. Inside, the fluorescent tubes hummed their constant insect song. The linoleum was cracked in 14 places. The counter stools, upholstered in red vinyl that had faded to the color of old brick, bore the impressions of 10,000 strangers who had come in out of the cold, eaten something warm, and disappeared back into whatever version of the city had swallowed them. It was 11 minutes past midnight, and the diner was empty except for the woman behind the counter and the sound of rain. Her name was Clara Malone. She was 23 years old, and she moved through the kitchen with the kind of efficiency that only comes from doing the same thing every day for years without the luxury of boredom. Her hands were quick and sure, scarred in small places from hot oil and dull knives, and her dark hair was pulled back tight beneath a net that she hated but wore because her father had always worn one, and some things you do not stop doing just because the person who taught you is gone. She was cleaning the flat-top grill with a pumice block, working in slow circles that her arms knew by memory, and she was not thinking about anything in particular when the bell above the door rang. The man who came in was barely a man at all. He was perhaps 25, but hunger and exhaustion had carved years into his face that did not belong there. His clothes were soaked through, a dark jacket that might once have been expensive, but now hung off his frame like something borrowed from a larger ghost, and his shoes left wet prints on the linoleum that Clara noticed before she noticed anything else about him. He stood in the doorway for a moment, and in that moment he did something that Clara would remember for the rest of her life. He did not look at the menu board. He did not look at the counter, or the stools, or the pie case, or the coffee machine. He looked at her, and in that look there was something she recognized, because she had seen it in the mirror during the worst months after her father died. It was the look of a person who has run out of options and knows it. He sat down at the far end of the counter, the stool closest to the wall, and he placed his hands flat on the formica surface and stared at them as if they belonged to someone else. His knuckles were split, not from a fight, Clara thought, but from something else, something repetitive and punishing, like hitting a wall until the wall or the hand gave out. She watched him from behind the grill, and she did not ask him what he wanted, because she already knew. She had seen men like this before. Men who came in with nothing and sat down anyway, hoping that the act of sitting in a warm place might be enough to keep them alive until morning. She poured a cup of coffee and set it in front of him without a word. He looked up at her, and his eyes were dark and steady, and there was something in them that was not defeat. It was something harder, something coiled, like a spring compressed past its tolerance. He opened his mouth and then closed it again, and Clara understood that he was trying to tell her he could not pay. She understood this because of the way his jaw tightened, and the way his fingers curled slightly inward, as if the admission cost him something physical. "I did not ask you for money," she said. She said it the way her father used to say things, plain and direct and without any sweetness that might be mistaken for pity. She turned back to the grill and began cracking eggs. 2 eggs, over easy, the way she made them for herself at the end of every shift. She laid 4 strips of bacon beside them and dropped 2 slices of sourdough into the toaster, and when it was all done, she slid the plate across the counter to him and set a clean fork on a napkin beside it. She did not look at his face while she did this. She looked at his hands, because hands tell you everything about a person that their face has learned to hide, and his hands, despite the split knuckles, were not the hands of a man who had always been poor. The fingers were long and precise, the nails trimmed close, and when he picked up the fork, he held it the way her father had taught her to hold a knife in the kitchen, with the handle seated deep in the palm and the thumb braced along the spine. It was the grip of someone who had been trained to hold tools with intention. He ate slowly, not with the desperate shoveling of true starvation, but with a measured deliberateness that struck Clara as almost ceremonial, as if each bite were being catalogued and stored. When he finished, he set the fork down parallel to the edge of the plate, and he sat there for a long time staring at the empty dish, and then he said something that she did not expect. He said, "What is your name?" Not "thank you." Not "how much do I owe you?" He asked her name, and the way he asked it was not casual. It was the way a person asks for something they intend to remember. "Clara," she said. "Clara Malone." He nodded once, a single, precise movement like the closing of a ledger. Then he reached into his jacket and produced a small fold of wet bills, perhaps $10 or $12, which he placed on the counter. She pushed them back toward him. He pushed them back toward her. She left them there because she understood that this was not about the money. It was about something else. It was about a man who had nothing refusing to accept that he had nothing, and she respected that, because her father had been the same way in the months before the end, paying every bill on time, even as the diagnosis ate through their savings like acid through paper. The stranger stood. He was taller than she had realized, and when he straightened, there was a quality to his posture that did not match the ruined jacket or the split knuckles. His shoulders were level, his spine was straight, and he moved with an economy of motion that reminded Clara of the ex-military men who sometimes came into the diner, men whose bodies had been trained to occupy space with maximum efficiency and minimum waste. He looked at her one more time, and this time something in his expression shifted, a micro-movement around the eyes that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one, and he said, "I will remember this, Clara Malone." Then he walked out into the rain, and the bell above the door rang once, and he was gone. Clara stood behind the counter and looked at the wet footprints on the linoleum, and as she watched, they began to fade, the moisture evaporating under the fluorescent lights, and within 20 minutes there was no physical evidence that the stranger had been there at all. The plate was washed. The cup was back on the shelf. The wet bills sat in the register, and the diner hummed around her the way it always did, as if the building itself had already absorbed the encounter into its long memory of strangers and storms and midnight kindnesses. She finished cleaning the grill. She turned off the fryers. She counted the register, which took less time than it should have, because there was less money in it than there should have been, and she locked the front door and flipped the sign from open to closed, and walked home to the one-bedroom apartment above the dry cleaner on 10th Street that smelled permanently of chemical solvents and someone else's cigarettes. She lay in bed and listened to the rain and thought about the stranger's hands, the way the split knuckles contradicted the precision of his grip, and she thought about his eyes and the compressed spring she had seen behind them, and she wondered what kind of pressure could do that to a person, could coil them so tight that even hunger and exhaustion could not unwind them. She wondered briefly if she would ever see him again. Then she slept, and by morning the wondering had been buried beneath the weight of the day's first tasks, the industrial-sized coffee percolator that needed descaling, the produce delivery that was 40 minutes late, the health inspector who was coming at noon, and the stranger slipped into the deep sediment of her memory, where all the faces of all the people she had fed eventually settled. She did not think about him for a long time after that. The days at Rosie's diner had a way of grinding memory into dust. There was always another shift to cover, another supplier to negotiate with, another piece of equipment failing in a way that required either money she did not have or ingenuity she was running out of. The diner had been her father's, and before that it had been her grandfather's, and the weight of that lineage pressed down on Clara like a physical thing, a load-bearing beam that she could neither set down nor shift to someone else's shoulders. Her father, Patrick Malone, had run Rosie's for 27 years with the same quiet, stubborn integrity that he had brought to everything in his life. He had never watered down the coffee. He had never bought the cheaper eggs. He had never turned away a person who was hungry, and he had done all of this while raising Clara alone after her mother left when Clara was 4, which meant that Clara had grown up in the back booth of Rosie's diner, doing her homework to the sound of sizzling grease and the low murmur of strangers' conversations, and the diner was not just a business to her. It was the architecture of her entire childhood. It was the only version of home she had ever known. Patrick Malone had died of pancreatic cancer 18 months before the stranger walked in out of the rain. The disease had moved through him with a speed that the doctors described as aggressive, a word that Clara came to hate because it made the cancer sound like a person with intentions, rather than a blind biological process that did not care about Patrick Malone's integrity or his sourdough recipe, or his daughter who was not ready to run a diner alone at 21. He had left her the business and a modest life insurance policy, and a set of principles that he had never written down, but that Clara knew by heart, because she had watched him live them every day. Feed the hungry, charge a fair price, keep the coffee hot and the kitchen clean. Never apologize for doing the right thing. She had been following those principles for 18 months, and they had cost her nearly everything. The neighborhood around 9th and Morrow had been changing, the way neighborhoods change in cities where money moves like weather, reshaping the landscape without asking permission. A development company called Helios Properties had been buying up buildings on both sides of the street for the past 2 years, and the pressure on the remaining holdouts, the pawn shop, the laundromat, the diner, had been increasing with a patience that was more frightening than any overt threat. Helios did not threaten. Helios sent letters. Helios sent representatives in pressed suits who smiled too much and spoke in sentences constructed entirely from words like opportunity and market value and inevitable. Helios had offered Clara $200,000 for the building, which was 3 times what it was worth on paper, and not even close to what it was worth to her. And she had said no, and the representative had smiled and said they would be in touch, and Clara had understood that in touch was a euphemism for something less polite. 5 years passed. They passed the way years pass for people who are too busy surviving to notice the calendar, in a blur of repetition broken only by the small crises that punctuated each season like cracks appearing in a dam. The walk-in refrigerator failed in July of the 2nd year, and Clara spent 3 days cooking everything in it before it spoiled, giving away plates of food to anyone who walked past the open door, and the sight of her standing on the sidewalk in 90-degree heat, handing pork chops to strangers, would have been funny if it had not been so desperate. The roof leaked in the 3rd year, a slow, persistent drip that worked its way through the ceiling tiles and left brown stains above the counter that looked like the continents on an old map. She fixed it herself, climbing up on a Sunday morning with a bucket of tar and a trowel, and the tar stuck to her hair and her hands and her clothes, and it took 3 showers to get it off, but the leak stopped, and that was enough. The gas line developed a fault in the 4th year, and for 2 weeks she cooked everything on electric hot plates, while a plumber she could not afford worked on the problem in installments, 2 hours on Monday, 2 hours on Thursday, because that was all she could pay for at a time, and the smell of gas lingered in the walls like a ghost that would not leave. Through all of it, the buildings around her transformed. The pawn shop became a wine bar called Minerva, with a menu printed on handmade paper and a cocktail list that used words like deconstructed and terroir. The laundromat became a co-working space with exposed brick and Edison bulbs, and a monthly membership fee that exceeded Clara's weekly grocery budget. A barbershop that had been cutting hair on 9th Street since before Clara was born closed and reopened as an artisanal cheese shop. A bodega became a gallery. A shoe repair became a juice bar. And Rosie's diner remained exactly what it had always been, a small, warm box of light on a street that no longer recognized it. The offers from Helios had stopped, which should have been a relief, but instead felt like the silence before something worse. Clara was 28 now, and the years had done what years do to people who carry too much weight with too little help. Her face was thinner, her hands were rougher. The dark circles beneath her eyes had become permanent residents. But she still made the coffee the way her father had made it, and she still did not turn away anyone who was hungry, and the flat-top grill still bore the mineral scars of 1,000 midnight cleanings, and the bell above the door still rang every time it opened, and it was ringing now. It was a Tuesday evening in October, and the diner was half full with the usual crowd, regulars who had been coming for years and who constituted the last living evidence that 9th and Morrow had once been a neighborhood rather than a development zone. Frank DeLuca, 74, a retired ironworker who ordered the same thing every night, meatloaf and mashed potatoes and a cup of decaf that he nursed for 2 hours while reading the newspaper from back to front. Nia Okafor, a night shift nurse from the hospital 3 blocks east, who came in for pie and silence before heading into 12 hours of other people's emergencies. Tommy Shin, 19, a community college student who bussed tables 3 nights a week in exchange for free meals and a place to study, and who Clara had come to think of as something between an employee and a younger brother. These were her people. This was her world. And it was about to be interrupted. The first thing Clara noticed was the sound, or rather, the absence of sound. The street outside, which always carried the low ambient hum of traffic and pedestrians and the bass throb of the wine bar's sound system, went quiet. Not gradually, not the way sound fades when rain picks up or a bus passes. It went quiet the way a room goes quiet when someone important walks in, except this was not a room. This was an entire city block. Clara looked up from the register, and through the rain-streaked window she saw them. 3 black SUVs, identical, their surfaces so dark and polished that they reflected the neon like liquid obsidian, had pulled to the curb in a formation that was too precise to be coincidental. They sat there, engines running, and the street seemed to reorganize itself around them, pedestrians shifting their paths without being told, crossing to the opposite sidewalk the way water divides around a stone. Frank DeLuca put down his newspaper. He had spent 40 years working steel on buildings that touched the sky, and he knew what authority looked like when it arrived somewhere, and this was authority. Nia Okafor set down her fork. Tommy Shin stopped wiping the table he was cleaning and stood still, the rag hanging from his hand like a white flag. Clara felt something shift in her chest, a tightening that was not quite fear but was adjacent to it. The way the barometric pressure drops before a storm, and you feel it in your joints before you see it in the sky. The doors of the middle SUV opened. 2 men emerged first, one from each side, and they were large in the way that certain men are large. Not fat, not bodybuilder swollen, but dense, as if gravity had a stronger claim on them than on ordinary people. They wore dark suits and dark overcoats, and their faces were professionally blank. The faces of men who had been trained to express nothing and had succeeded completely. They took positions on either side of the SUV's rear door, and one of them opened it, and the man who stepped out onto the wet sidewalk was not what Clara expected. She had expected someone large, someone physically imposing, someone whose body matched the armored vehicles and the stone-faced escorts. Instead, the man was lean, not thin, but economical, as if every ounce of excess had been burned away, and what remained was pure function. He wore a black overcoat over a charcoal suit, no tie, the collar of his white shirt open at the throat, and his shoes made no sound on the wet pavement, which should have been impossible, but was somehow true. His hair was dark and cut close, and his face was composed of angles and planes that gave nothing away. A face built for silence, for watching, for waiting. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment and looked at the diner, and Clara saw his eyes move across the neon sign with its missing letter, across the rain-streaked windows, across the cracked awning, and something happened to his face. It was not a smile. It was not sadness. It was recognition. The kind of recognition that comes from deep inside the architecture of memory, the way you recognize the house you grew up in even after decades of change have altered every surface. He walked toward the door. His 2 escorts moved to follow, and without turning around he raised his left hand slightly, a gesture so small it was barely visible, and they stopped. They did not argue. They did not hesitate. They simply stopped, as if his hand had pressed a button that deactivated their forward motion. He walked the remaining 10 feet alone, and when he pushed open the door of Rosie's diner, the bell rang, and the sound of it in the silence was enormous. Every person in the diner was looking at him. Frank DeLuca, whose hands had shaped the skyline, was gripping his coffee cup with both hands. Nia Okafor had shifted slightly in her booth, her nurse's instinct positioning her body between the door and the nearest exit. Tommy Shin had not moved at all, frozen in the posture of a young man who senses that the rules of the world he understands have just been suspended. And Clara, behind the counter, was looking at the man's face and feeling something uncoil in her memory, a thread being pulled from a place so deep she had almost forgotten it was there. The man walked to the counter. He did not look at the menu board. He did not look at the stools or the pie case or the coffee machine. He looked at her, and Clara felt the floor shift beneath her feet, not physically, not literally, but in the way that reality shifts when a piece of the past walks back into the present and stands before you wearing a $15,000 overcoat. She knew those eyes, dark and steady and containing something that was not defeat, something coiled, something that 5 years ago, had been compressed past its tolerance and was now, unmistakably, fully released. He sat down. The same stool, the far end of the counter, closest to the wall. He placed his hands flat on the formica surface and looked at them, and his knuckles were no longer split. His hands were clean and manicured and still, and the precision of his fingers had not changed, but everything around them had. He looked up at Clara, and the silence between them was a living thing, a third presence in the room with its own weight and temperature. "Hello, Clara Malone," he said. His voice was quiet. Not soft, not gentle, but quiet in the way that certain sounds are quiet because they do not need volume. A blade does not need to be loud. A verdict does not need to be shouted. His voice was the verbal equivalent of his hand gesture outside, a small thing that commanded total obedience from the air around it. Clara's hands were trembling, and she pressed them flat against the counter to stop the trembling, and she looked at him, and she did not say hello. She said, "You came back." He tilted his head slightly, and there it was again, that micro-movement around the eyes that was not quite a smile. "I told you I would remember," he said. The development around 9th and Morrow had not been random. Clara had always suspected this, but suspicion is a different animal than certainty, and certainty was what walked into her diner that October evening. His name, she would learn, was Dominic Aurelio. In the 5 years since he had sat at her counter with split knuckles and an empty stomach, he had become something that the city discussed only in careful whispers and coded references, the way ancient peoples spoke of storms or plagues, not by name, but by effect. He was not a businessman, though he owned businesses. He was not a politician, though politicians sought his counsel. He was not a criminal, though the law regarded him with the wary respect that a zookeeper gives to a predator whose cage door has a faulty lock. He was something else, something that existed in the spaces between these categories, in the shadow architecture of power that runs beneath every city like a second nervous system. What Dominic Aurelio was, in the language of the streets and the tabloids and the federal prosecutors, who had tried and failed to build a case against him 3 separate times, was the head of a family. Not a family in the biological sense, though biology played its part. A family in the older sense. A structure. An organization. A nation within a nation, with its own laws, its own economy, its own moral code that bore no resemblance to the one printed in civics textbooks, but was, in its own way, just as rigid and just as ruthlessly enforced. He had inherited this position not through birthright, but through a series of events that the city's underworld still discussed with a mixture of admiration and fear, events that had begun approximately 4 months after he walked out of Rosie's diner into the rain. The stories that circulated about those 4 months varied in their details, but agreed on their shape. A young man with nothing, no connections, no capital, no name, had walked into a world that consumed people like him the way a furnace consumes paper, and instead of burning, he had become the furnace. The specifics were the stuff of whispered bar conversations and federal surveillance transcripts that had been redacted so heavily they read like poetry. There was a debt he collected that no one else had dared to collect. There was a man he stood beside, when standing beside that man meant certain death. And the death came for everyone except Dominic Aurelio. And the people who survived that night, and the nights that followed, understood that what they were witnessing was not luck. It was something rarer. It was the emergence of a natural force, the kind of person who bends the world to his shape rather than being bent by it. By the end of the first year, he had a seat at a table where men 3 times his age had waited decades for a chair. By the end of the 3rd year, he owned the table. By the 5th year, the year he walked back into Rosie's diner, he owned the room the table was in, and the building that contained the room, and the block that contained the building, and the understanding of every person in the city who operated in the shadow economy that Dominic Aurelio's word was the last word, and his silence was worse than anyone else's shouting. Clara did not know any of this. She knew only that the man sitting at her counter was the same man she had fed 5 years ago, and that he was now surrounded by a visible field of power that altered the behavior of everyone in his proximity, including her. She poured a cup of coffee and set it in front of him, and the gesture was identical to the one she had made 5 years ago, but everything else about it was different. 5 years ago, it had been an act of mercy. Now it was something she could not name, a bridge between two versions of the same moment, a thread connecting who they had been to who they were. He wrapped his hands around the cup. The steam rose between his fingers, and for a moment his face changed, the mask of control softening by a single degree, and Clara saw beneath it the ghost of the man who had come in from the rain with nothing. It lasted less than a second. Then the mask returned, seamless and complete. "This place," he said, looking around the diner with eyes that missed nothing. "It has not changed." Clara wiped the counter with a rag she did not need to use. "The world outside it has," she said. He nodded. "I know," he said. And then he said something that made Clara's hands stop moving. "I know about Helios," he said. The temperature in the diner dropped. Not literally, but in the way that a shared understanding of danger changes the quality of the air. Frank DeLuca looked up from his newspaper. He had been pretending not to listen, but the pretense was wearing thin, and the word Helios had cut through it like a blade through wet paper. Everyone on 9th and Morrow knew about Helios. Everyone on 9th and Morrow understood that the development company's patience was not benevolence, but strategy, the patient circling of a predator that knows its prey has nowhere to run. Clara said nothing. She folded the rag into a precise square and set it beneath the counter and met Dominic Aurelio's eyes with an expression that he recognized, because it was the same expression she had worn 5 years ago, when she pushed his money back across the counter. It was the expression of a person who would not be pitied. "I am not here to buy your diner," he said. He said it plainly, without emphasis, and the plainness of it was more convincing than any protestation would have been. "I am here because I owe a debt, and I pay my debts." Clara wanted to tell him that he did not owe her anything. She wanted to tell him that a plate of eggs and bacon and a cup of coffee did not constitute a debt, not by any accounting system she recognized. But she did not say this, because looking at him, she understood that his accounting system was different from hers. In his world, the world he now inhabited and commanded, a debt was not measured in dollars. It was measured in something older and heavier, in the currency of honor and obligation, and the sacred weight of a kindness extended when it cost the giver something real. Clara had been barely surviving when she fed him. She had given him food she could not afford to give away, and in Dominic Aurelio's ledger, that meant something that could not be repaid with a check. The door of the diner opened again. The bell rang, and this time it was not a man in a $15,000 overcoat. It was 3 men in suits that cost approximately 1/10 of that, men whose smiles arrived before they did, smiles that had been constructed in a laboratory of corporate persuasion and field-tested on 100 reluctant property owners before being deployed here, in this diner, on this night. The lead man was tall and pale with the kind of tan that comes from a salon rather than the sun, and his name was Garrett Voss, and he was the senior acquisitions director of Helios Properties, and he had been instructed by his superiors to close the 9th and Morrow deal by the end of the quarter, and the end of the quarter was 9 days away. Garrett Voss did not notice the black SUVs outside. Or rather, he noticed them the way a person notices furniture in someone else's house, as objects that existed in someone else's context and had no bearing on his own. This was a miscalculation of historic proportions. He walked into Rosie's diner with his 2 associates flanking him in a formation that was probably meant to convey authority, but instead conveyed the awkward choreography of men who had practiced this entrance in a parking lot. He looked around the diner with an expression that combined assessment with distaste, the expression of a man who sees everything in terms of square footage and sees this particular square footage as profoundly undervalued. "Ms. Malone," he said, and his voice carried the bright, aggressive friendliness of a man who has been told no before and considers it a temporary inconvenience. "I hope this is a good time." Clara looked at him. Then she looked at Dominic Aurelio, who had not turned around, who was sitting at the counter with his coffee between his hands and his back to the door, and whose stillness had acquired a new quality, a density, as if the air around him had thickened and was now exerting a pressure that only certain people could feel. Garrett Voss could not feel it. His associates could not feel it. They were calibrated for a different frequency of power, the institutional kind, the kind that comes with letterheads and legal teams and quarterly earnings reports. The kind of power that sat at the counter drinking coffee from a chipped ceramic mug was something they had never encountered and were not equipped to recognize. "Mr. Voss," Clara said, "this is not a good time." Garrett Voss smiled wider. He had a script, and he was going to follow it. "Ms. Malone, I understand your attachment to this property. I respect it. Family history, community roots, I get it. But I have been authorized to present a revised offer that I think you will find substantially more generous than our previous conversations." He reached into his jacket and produced a folder, cream-colored, embossed with the Helios logo, and laid it on the counter as if he were serving a meal. $350,000, he said. "For the building, the fixtures, the name, the lot. That is nearly 5 times market value, Ms. Malone. That is the kind of offer that does not come twice." Clara did not look at the folder. She looked at Garrett Voss's hands because her father had taught her that hands tell you everything. And Garrett Voss's hands were soft and moisturized and had never held a pumice block or a cast-iron skillet or the hand of a dying man. They were the hands of someone who moved paper from one side of a desk to the other and called it work. "No," Clara said. Garrett Voss's smile flickered, just for an instant like a bulb with a loose connection, and in that instant Clara saw what was behind it, the same thing that was always behind it, the knowledge that the smile was a formality, and that Helios had other tools in its toolkit, tools that did not smile. He recovered quickly. "Ms. Malone, I strongly advise you to consider this offer carefully. The development of this block is proceeding with or without your cooperation. Your property is the last remaining obstacle to a project that represents significant investment from people who are not accustomed to being obstructed. I would hate for this process to become adversarial." It was the word adversarial that did it. It hung in the air like a blade, and the specific type of silence that followed it was the silence of a room full of people who understood that a threat had just been made in the language of people who make threats for a living. Frank DeLuca set down his coffee cup. Nia Okafor's hand found her phone. Tommy Shin took a step backward, and Dominic Aurelio set down his coffee cup and turned around on his stool. The movement was slow, unhurried, a rotation of the body on the stool's axis that took perhaps 3 seconds and contained more controlled power than any gesture Clara had ever witnessed. He did not stand. He simply turned, and when he was facing Garrett Voss, he looked at him, and the looking was an act of such total, penetrating attention that Garrett Voss stopped talking mid-breath. It was not a threatening look. It was not angry. It was the way a person looks at something they are evaluating, the way an appraiser looks at a painting, the way a surgeon looks at an X-ray, the way a predator looks at something it has not yet decided is worth the effort of consuming. Dominic Aurelio said nothing. He simply looked. And in the silence that followed, a silence that stretched across the diner like a wire being tightened, Garrett Voss's body began to betray him. It started with the hands. The folder he was holding developed a fine tremor, barely visible, the kind of tremor that the body produces when the ancient animal brain recognizes a threat that the modern cognitive brain has not yet processed. Then the color. It drained from his salon tan in a slow tide, starting at the collar and moving upward, until his face was the color of the cream-colored Helios folder in his hands. Then the posture, the manufactured confidence, the rehearsed stance, the carefully arranged shoulders, all of it softened and sagged, like a building losing its structural integrity one beam at a time. "Who?" Garrett Voss said, and his voice had lost its brightness, its aggressive friendliness, its entire manufactured personality, and what was left was the voice of a man who has just realized that he has walked into a room he should not have entered. "Who are you?" Dominic Aurelio did not answer. One of his associates who had entered the diner at some point during the exchange without Clara noticing, a large man in a dark suit with the professionally blank face of all Aurelio's people, took a single step forward and leaned close to Garrett Voss's ear and said something. He said it quietly, so quietly that no one else in the diner heard the words, but the effect of those words on Garrett Voss was immediate and total. The folder slipped from his fingers. It hit the linoleum with a soft slap. He did not pick it up. His associates, who had been standing behind him with the eager postures of men who expected to witness a successful negotiation, were now standing with the rigid postures of men who were calculating the distance to the door. Garrett Voss swallowed. The movement of his throat was visible from across the room. He opened his mouth, and what came out was not the smooth acquisitions pitch he had been hired to deliver. What came out was a single syllable, a sound that was half apology and half prayer. "Sir," he said. Dominic Aurelio looked at the folder on the floor. Then he looked at Garrett Voss. Then he spoke, and his voice was exactly as quiet as it had been when he said hello to Clara, but the quietness now carried a different charge, the way the same voltage can power a lamp or stop a heart depending on how it is applied. "You are standing in a place that matters to me," he said. "You have come here to threaten a person who matters to me. You have used the word adversarial in a room where I am drinking coffee." He paused. The pause lasted 2 seconds. It was the longest 2 seconds of Garrett Voss's professional career. "I want you to pick up your folder. I want you to walk out of this diner. I want you to call whoever sent you and tell them that 9th and Morrow is not available. Not this block, not this building, not this woman's diner, not now, not ever." He took a sip of his coffee. "Can you do that?" It was not a question. It was formatted as a question, but it was a command, and Garrett Voss recognized this the way a drowning man recognizes a rope, as the only viable option in a situation with no other options. He bent down and picked up the folder, and the motion of bending was stiff and mechanical, as if his body had forgotten how joints worked. He straightened. He looked at Clara. He looked at Dominic Aurelio. He looked at the door. He said. "Yes, I can do that." He walked out. His associates followed. They moved quickly but did not run, which was the gait of men who wanted very much to run, but understood that running would constitute an admission they were not prepared to make. The bell rang 3 times as they left, and then the door closed, and the SUVs outside sat patient and dark and gleaming, and through the window Clara watched the 3 men walk rapidly to a silver sedan parked half a block down and get in and drive away, and the sedan's taillights disappeared around the corner, and they were gone. The diner exhaled. It was a collective sound, a shared release of held breath, and in it Clara could hear Frank DeLuca's relief, and Nia Okafor's measured calm, and Tommy Shin's young astonishment, and her own heartbeat, which was loud in her ears and steady like the drumming of rain on the tin awning. She looked at Dominic Aurelio, who had turned back to his coffee, and was drinking it as if nothing had happened. As if the last 3 minutes had been a minor interruption in an otherwise pleasant evening, and she felt something move through her that was too complicated for a single word. It was gratitude, and fear, and anger, and awe, and a deep, bone-level weariness from 5 years of fighting alone, and it pressed against the inside of her ribs, like a wave against a seawall. "You cannot just do that," she said. Her voice was even, but her hands were gripping the edge of the counter. "You cannot just walk in here after 5 years and make my problems disappear because you feel like you owe me for a plate of eggs." Dominic Aurelio set down his cup. He looked at her, and the mask slipped again, just for a moment, and beneath it she saw the man from 5 years ago, the one with the split knuckles and the soaked jacket, and the look in his eyes that she had recognized because she had seen it in her own mirror. When he spoke, his voice was different, not quieter, not louder, but closer, as if he had taken a step toward her without moving his body. "It was not about the eggs," he said. "It was about who you were when you gave them to me. I have been in rooms with men who control more money than most countries. I have sat across from men who would sell their own blood for advantage. And in all of it, in all the years since that night, the thing I have not been able to find anywhere else is what you did. You saw a man with nothing, and you fed him without being asked, without expecting anything, without hesitating." He paused. "Do you know how rare that is? Not the act the instinct, the kind of person who does it. Clara's grip on the counter loosened. She did not look away from him. She could feel the weight of the diner around her, the humming fluorescence and the cracked linoleum, and the ghosts of 10,000 strangers, and her father's recipe for sourdough, and the echo of his voice saying, "Feed the hungry, charge a fair price, never apologize for doing the right thing." And she understood something that she had not understood before. She understood that what she had given the stranger 5 years ago was not a plate of food. It was evidence of a principle that he had been searching for, proof that the kind of person her father had been still existed somewhere in the world, and that proof had meant something to a man who was about to become one of the most powerful and feared figures in the city. She had not saved his life. She had saved something in him that was worth more than his life. She had saved his belief that goodness was real. The diner was quiet. Frank DeLuca had gone back to his newspaper, but he was not reading it. Nia Okafor was watching Clara with the steady, assessing gaze of a woman who spent her professional life reading vital signs. Tommy Shin was standing very still by the table he had been cleaning, and his eyes were wide, and Clara knew that he was witnessing something that would reshape his understanding of how the world worked. Dominic Aurelio reached into his overcoat and produced a card. It was black, matte, with nothing on it but a phone number embossed in silver. He set it on the counter between them. "This is not charity," he said. "This is a standing offer. If you ever need anything, if anyone ever comes through that door and makes you feel the way that man just made you feel, you call that number, day or night. There will be someone on the other end, and whatever the problem is, it will be handled." Clara looked at the card. She did not pick it up. She looked at Dominic Aurelio, and she said something that surprised both of them. "Stay," she said. "Have dinner. I just pulled a pot roast out of the oven 20 minutes ago, and it is the best thing on the menu, and nobody orders it because nobody knows it exists because I only make it on Tuesdays." Something happened to Dominic Aurelio's face. The mask did not slip this time. It dissolved. For a span of perhaps 5 seconds, the most powerful man in the city was simply a man, sitting at a counter in a diner being offered a hot meal by a woman who made no distinction between him and anyone else who walked through the door, and the expression on his face was one that Clara suspected very few people had ever seen. It was the expression of a person who has been carrying a weight so heavy that they have forgotten what it feels like to set it down, and who has just been given, unexpectedly and without conditions, permission to set it down. He nodded. "The pot roast," he said. Clara turned to the kitchen and began to plate the food, and as she did, she heard him say something to himself, so quietly that she almost missed it. He said, "She still does not charge enough for the coffee." And something cracked in Clara's chest, a small fissure in the wall she had been building for 5 years, and she laughed. It was a short laugh, barely a sound, but it was real, and it was the first time she had laughed in longer than she could remember. She served him the pot roast with roasted carrots and mashed potatoes and a slice of sourdough on the side, and he ate it the same way he had eaten the eggs 5 years ago. Slowly, deliberately, as if each bite were being catalogued. She poured more coffee. She did not sit down, because she was working, but she stood on the other side of the counter and they talked, and the conversation was careful and strange, and unlike anything she had experienced, because he told her things about the world he inhabited, in the same tone that she told him things about the diner, as if these two worlds, the world of power and shadow, and the world of cracked linoleum and pot roast, were equally real and equally worthy of description. Around them, the diner settled into its nighttime rhythm. Frank DeLuca left at his usual time, 10:30, placing his exact change on the counter, and giving Clara a nod that contained more meaning than any speech could have held. Nia Okafor slipped out for her shift, pausing at the door to look back once, her nurse's eyes confirming that her patient, which in this case was Clara, was stable. Tommy Shin finished bussing the last tables and retreated to the kitchen, where he pretended to organize the walk-in cooler while straining to hear every word he could through the pass-through window. The diner emptied around them like a theater after the show, until it was just Clara and Dominic and the hum of the fluorescence in the rain, which had returned sometime during the confrontation with Garrett Voss, and was now tapping against the windows, with the gentle persistence of an old friend asking to be let in. He told her that the night he came into her diner, he had been 3 days away from either dying or becoming what he became, and that the choice between those two options had been made in the hour after he left her counter. He told her that the meal she gave him was the last act of unconditional kindness he had received before entering a world where kindness was either strategic or non-existent. He told her that he had kept track of her diner for 5 years, not through surveillance or investigation, but through a single instruction given to a single trusted associate. Watch that diner. Tell me if anything threatens it. And when the associate had reported the escalating pressure from Helios Properties, Dominic Aurelio had cleared his schedule for the evening. Clara listened. She cleaned the grill and refilled the coffee and listened. And when he was done, she told him about her father. About the cancer that moved through Patrick Malone like a fire through dry wood. About the months of hospital visits and insurance forms and the slow, terrible arithmetic of watching a person you love become smaller and smaller until they disappear. About the weight of running a diner alone and the specific loneliness of being the last person standing in a place that the world has decided it no longer needs. She told him these things not because she wanted his sympathy, but because he had been honest with her, and she believed in reciprocity, in the equal exchange of truth, which was another thing her father had taught her. When she finished, Dominic Aurelio was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Your father sounds like a man I wish I had known." "He was," Clara said. "He was exactly that." Dominic Aurelio stood. He left $300 on the counter, which was approximately 15 times the cost of a pot roast dinner with coffee, and when Clara opened her mouth to protest, he shook his head once, a single, precise motion. "The card stays," he said, looking at the black card still sitting on the formica. "And so does the money." He buttoned his overcoat. "And Clara, the diner stays too, for as long as you want it." He walked to the door. His hand rested on the frame for a moment, and he turned back. "One more thing. In 9 days, when the Helios quarter ends, and they call you because they will call you, because men like that always try one more time, you tell them to check their permits. All of them. Every permit they hold on 9th and Morrow. They will find that certain approvals have been reconsidered. Certain inspections have been rescheduled. Certain zoning variances that were granted with unusual speed will be subject to unusual scrutiny." He paused. "The city has a long memory, Clara. Longer than theirs." The bell rang. He walked to the middle SUV. His 2 escorts opened the door. He got in. The 3 vehicles pulled away from the curb in silent unison, their taillights red and steady in the rain, and then they turned the corner, and the street was just a street again, wet and dark and ordinary. Clara stood behind the counter for a long time after he left. The diner hummed around her. Frank DeLuca folded his newspaper and stood up, and as he passed the counter, he said, "Good pot roast tonight, Clara." Nia Okafor left her usual tip and paused at the door and said, "You okay, hun?" And Clara nodded, and Nia nodded back and walked out into the rain toward her shift. Tommy Shin, who had been silent for the entire encounter, began collecting dishes, and after a while he said, "Clara, who was that guy?" Clara picked up the black card and looked at it. The silver numbers caught the fluorescent light. "Someone I fed once," she said, and she slid the card into her apron pocket and went back to cleaning the grill. 9 days later, Helios Properties announced the indefinite suspension of its 9th and Morrow development project, citing regulatory complications. The announcement was 3 sentences long and was buried in the business section of the local paper, but on 9th and Morrow, it landed like a thunderclap. Within a month, 3 separate city agencies opened investigations into the speed with which Helios had obtained its original permits. Within 2 months, the company's stock had dropped 4%, and the CEO had given a carefully worded statement about refocusing priorities on less complex markets. The wine bar stayed. The co-working space stayed. But the pressure stopped. The letters stopped. The men in pressed suits with manufactured smiles stopped coming, and the silence that replaced them was not the silence before something worse. It was the silence of peace. Clara did not call the number on the card. Not that month, not that year. She kept it in the drawer beneath the register, and it sat there like a small dark anchor, a reminder that somewhere in the city's shadow architecture there was a man who remembered a plate of eggs and a cup of coffee, and a woman who had not asked for anything in return. She did not need to call. The knowledge that she could was enough. It was the difference between drowning and floating, between fighting alone and knowing that somewhere, invisible and silent, someone was watching the water. The neighborhood noticed the change before Clara did. It was not a dramatic transformation, but a gradual one, the way a river changes course over years, imperceptibly at first, and then suddenly and obviously. The wine bar next door, Minerva, began sending its Saturday night overflow to Rosie's for coffee and pie, and the young professionals who stumbled in at 11 o'clock, expecting to be amused by the retro aesthetic, stayed for the sourdough toast and came back on Sunday mornings without irony. The co-working space on the other side started an unofficial tradition of Friday team lunches at the diner, and within 6 months there was a line out the door on Fridays that Clara had to manage with a handwritten list and a system of numbered tickets that she kept in a coffee can by the register. The neighborhood had not stopped changing, but the change had begun to flow around the diner rather than against it, the way a city learns to build around a landmark rather than through it, and Rosie's diner, which had been an obstacle, became an anchor, the fixed point around which Ninth and Morrow organized its new identity. She hired Tommy full-time. She replaced the neon sign, all the letters, and it read Rosie's in clean pink light that did not bleed or flicker. She resurfaced the counter and reupholstered the stools in new red vinyl, the same shade her grandfather had chosen in 1974. She kept the prices fair. She kept the coffee hot. She kept making pot roast on Tuesdays, and on some Tuesday nights, though not every week and never on a schedule she could predict, a black SUV would pull to the curb, and a man in a dark overcoat would walk in alone, and the bell would ring, and he would sit at the far end of the counter, and Clara would pour a cup of coffee and set it in front of him without a word, and for an hour or so, the most feared man in the city would simply be a man eating dinner in a diner, and the diner would be what it had always been, and what Clara's father had always intended it to be. A place where anyone could sit down and be warm and be fed, and not be asked for anything except to be human. 3 years after Dominic Aurelio walked back into her life, Clara Malone won the city's Small Business Preservation Award. She accepted it in a ceremony at City Hall, wearing the same apron she wore behind the counter, because she had come straight from the lunch rush, and saw no reason to pretend she was anyone other than who she was. In her acceptance speech, which was 4 sentences long, she said, "My father taught me that a diner is not a business. It is a promise. You keep the coffee hot and the door open, and you feed whoever walks in, and you do not ask questions, and you do not keep score, because the moment you start keeping score, you have already lost the thing that made you worth walking into in the first place." In the back of the room, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed and his face half in shadow, a man in a dark overcoat listened to these words and nodded once. A single, precise movement, like the closing of a ledger. Then he straightened his collar and walked out a side exit, and the door closed behind him without a sound, and he was gone. The strongest walls are not built with steel or stone. They are built with a plate of food, offered freely to a stranger in the rain.